Hey, I'm Creed with HomeBuyer.University. Well, today we're finally going to get around to the Colorado Real Estate Sales Contract, also known here, Contract to Buy and Sell Real Estate Residential. So if you want to buy something other than a home, a townhome, or a condo, you'd be using a different contract, but this takes care of about 95% of most homebuyers' needs. As always, this has been approved by the Colorado Real Estate Commission, as you see on the top. And this form has legal consequences, and the party should consult legal and tax or other counsel before signing. Nothing we ever talk about here is legal or tax or accounting advice. It's not engineering advice either, even if we sneak into that a little bit. This is just good information coming from a longtime broker, designed to help you stress a bit less as you're trying to purchase a home, search and purchase for your home. It starts off sounding very simple, and agreement. Buyer agrees to buy and seller agrees to sell the property described below on the terms and conditions set forth in the contract. Sounds simple, but I promise you this is going to get long and hard. So what we're going to do is I'm going to give you a really sound and solid overview of the contract, but there are going to be particular areas of this contract that are going to be part of a separate course. Otherwise, we would be here for hours. The real estate brokers take a course on contracts typically about every year, and it's 3 hours long, and it usually just covers the changes in the contract, not the entire contract. So you don't want to live through that. I'm going to give you a great overview, some real-life scenarios, what I think is some pretty good advice. Every seller, every home buyer, every home is a little bit different. So this is a good overview, but your situation will probably need some adjustments, okay? Fair enough? Let's just real quickly talk about this. Joint tenants and tenants in common. This is how you can take possession of a home you're typically going to be living in. Joint tenants is often a married couple, but it could be otherwise. And it simply means that you both own 50% of the home, and it's indivisible. In other words, you can't sell one half and somebody else buy it and move in. Whereas tenants in common, the second choice, that's actually how you could do it. You could own 1/3, your partner could own 2/3, and at some point they could actually sell out their 2/3 to somebody else. So just kind of keep that in mind as you're looking at things. Property. What goes in this blue box is the legal description of the property. And that's how all of the documents are processed. That's how title companies ensure you're getting a free and clear title. And any problems that occur is going to be based on that legal description. Yep, we're going to put an address in here. But if there's a conflict in legal documents or research or anything on the home, the legal description is going to supersede the address. So if one or the other is wrong, this one is what everybody's going to be using. And you could actually purchase a property that you thought was a different property. So you want to make sure that your broker gets in the correct legal description. We're going to just barely touch on a few of these things, but I want you to be aware of them. Essentially, inclusions are things that are going to go with the home that you are purchasing. And it's really important to define a few of those. And this starts off doing that for you. These are considered inclusions unless somebody excludes them, which would be the seller. There's inclusions that aren't actually attached to the property. Now you might be looking at things like curtain rods and fireplace inserts and think, yeah, that goes with it. Well, officially it's not attached, and so it's really good to have that defined in the contract. And then anything specific, other inclusions, you would put in this box. And, that might be like a shed on the back corner of the lot or anything that could go along with that. Maybe a swing set, right? Is it attached to the house? No. Did you think it was going with the property? Yeah. But let's make sure and define that. Okay, so we're starting off fairly simple. We won't really touch this, but encumbered inclusions could be things like solar panels or security system, things that are kind of leased from a third party, something like that. Parking and storage facilities. This one gets to be really important with condos and townhomes. Your parking spot, whether assigned or open parking, may or may not go with the property. There's a really good chance if it's open parking that it's part of just the community. And if it's assigned, it may or may not be actually conveyed or sold with the condo or townhome that you're purchasing. You'll want to check that and know that for sure. And if so, man, you want to put in if there's a legal description for it and a parking number for it and so on and so forth. Those parking numbers might change from time to time based on just the need of the community manager and the residents. So if there's some sort of legal description within the deed of the property you're buying, make sure that gets in here, okay? Here's where other exclusions could be. We're not going to touch too much on water rights and well rights. Most of the clients that we have are going to be buying a property in a subdivision, and their water's coming from a public facility of some sort, okay? If you're buying a property with well or other water rights, then you need to go into that a little more specific. Paragraph 3, this is a biggie. This is where all of the events that are going to happen in this pretty much entire contract are listed. It's almost like a table of content or a index of what's in the contract. And keeping in mind, this contract is 19 pages, fairly small print. I've got you up on a big old 48 inch. I forget how big the screen is. It's a big screen. And I've got it blown up. When you see this in real life, this is small print. And so the best way to treat this, and let me use one good example, and the example we're going to use is the inspection contingency. And we're going to scroll down to that in just a minute. That's paragraph 10 series. And what you need to know is when it says reference, see where it says reference right here, and this little legal symbol, what that's doing is it's telling you that this particular event that you're putting a time or a deadline for, okay, is related to this paragraph series within this contract, okay? And let me show you a really quick example so you understand the concept, and then we're going to come back up. Paragraph 10, and that's a series of paragraphs you'll see quickly, has to do with the seller's property disclosure, okay? And we're going to scroll down to paragraph 10 as quickly as we can. It also has to do with the inspection and a bunch of other things. And that's why we're going to use that as an example. Bear with me. It's a long document, and you should never take this lightly. By the way, this is only about halfway through the document, and we're just getting to paragraph 10. They talk about the seller's property disclosure. We're going to mention that, but that is going to be a separate course. It's too complicated. It would take too long to pull that out now. But we are going to talk about the inspection and use that as our example. So this is paragraph 10, just like we expected. But see how long paragraph 10 is? It's got a lot of subparagraphs, right? You see all this? Yeah, but you can use that front, that page 3, page 4, depends on where the paragraphs break off, that dates and times and deadlines, that is your table of content. And there's so many important things in that, and we're going to come back to it in a minute, but I want to show you an example. So let's talk about just the inspection portion of paragraph 10. Whenever you buy a home, don't rely on your broker to know everything about it. Don't rely solely on the homeowners, the home seller's property disclosure. you should almost always get an inspection, a third-party inspection. But let's stop for a second. I don't want to complicate this too much. We're going to talk about it in depth in a separate video, separate part of the course. But a general home inspector doesn't know everything. And so if they see something they don't like or might be iffy on a roof, heating, electrical, foundation matters, so on, they're going to say, now go get an expert that specializes in that. So we'll cover that more in depth when we get to the inspection phase. Let's use this as an example. So up on pages 3 and 4, we had that whole series, that kind of like an accounting grid there of events and then deadlines. Okay, and we're going to use this as just one example, but then it relates to many of the other processes for many of the other things and deadlines that you have to deal with. Essentially, we call them contingencies, which means the home sale is based on those items being satisfactory by a specific date, or it gives you an option to renegotiate or get out of the contract, and we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. So within that grid section of dates, there might be something in there for an inspection termination. And I'll touch on this one really quick. We'll go deeper on the outside video. Let's say the seller says, you know what, I'm selling strictly as is. I'm not going to negotiate any kind of inspection. Then what your broker's probably going to use is this inspection termination, which says, we're going to look at the property, the home buyer is, and we'll either say yes or no based on what we find. And that's all there is to it. Now let's go down here so we understand our dates a little bit better. That's kind of off on its own. And then the inspection objection, and an inspection resolution is a different system, if you will. Here, there's going to be a specific date in that grid that states you will have conducted an inspection and reviewed the results by X date. Let's say it's 10 days from contract. Okay. Then you're going to have a grid in there that says inspection objection. And let's say that's 12 days from contract. So you got this done. There was something in it within those 10 days. And before the 12th day, and these will be actual dates in most cases, you're going to say, listen, we found out some electrical problems and some heating, plumbing problems. You're going to list those, and you may or may not include the actual inspection report. And you need to do that before that date expires. If you do that before the date expires, it opens up negotiations. If you do that after that date has expired, you have waived the right to that inspection objection. Does that make sense? If you do it within your time frame, you're moving right along. If you accidentally miss a deadline, that is legally saying, I've waived the right to have anybody deal with this for me. So you do your inspection, 10 days, you object within the 12th day, and you'll put within the objection how many days before you and the seller have to come up with a resolution on how you're going to handle this. Are they going to have those things fixed? And are they going to be fixed by a licensed person or a group of people if it's different items? Or are they going to give you some money at closing to compensate you for those? Okay. If the seller signs off on your inspection resolution and accomplishes those tasks, you're good to go. Keep in mind that the seller could say, you know what, you sent over this objection. I don't want to deal with any of that. Then what happens? You either withdraw your objection before the end of this resolution period, okay, and say, okay, never mind, I'll take it as is. Or you just let the whole contract expire, right? Or you go ahead and file an official notice that you're going to dissolve the contract. And that's how all these dates work. So let's roll back up there. Yep, it's a long contract. We only had gotten about halfway down, and you can see all the stuff. This is why I've got to keep this as basic as possible. Okay, so we're back up here, and this is page, I'm sorry, I said 3 and 4 is page 2 and 3. This happens to be paragraph 3. So each one of these, and let's go ahead and find our inspection information. We just talked about these 3 items. If we were going just as I buy it or I don't buy it based on what I see, you would have used this. If you wanted to get a inspection and an opportunity to negotiate based on the outcome of that inspection, you would have put these dates in there. So this would have held that 10 days out. It would actually be a fixed date often. And then we would have the inspection objection. In our case, we used 12 days out. And then we would have an inspection resolution deadline. And let's say you had gone to 15 days. Either you and the seller come to terms, written terms, on how things are going to be handled based on your inspection, or this contract can be dissolved. Sound fair? And that's pretty much how all of this happens. And again, this is like your table of contents. Now, not everything is going to be in an exact date order, like this is date 1, date 2, date 3, date 4. Be careful there. But anything that's in here is a drop dead date. You either have it by that date, you've either responded to it by a date, or you have give some sort of a resolution option date, or there's a date in there that says, okay, at this point, I'm just going to dissolve this contract if I can't work out any of these things. Gets complicated quick, and we're just going to touch on them. Time of day deadline. By the way, the whole contract defaults to, when you say a whole day, the 1st of January. Actually, it's a holiday. Let's say the 2nd of January. If that's a business day, weekday, this would go all the way to 11:59 and 59 seconds p.m., just before midnight. You can put in here and change that and say, you know what, everything has to be, end of day is 6 p.m. or 8 p.m. Otherwise, on each one of these dates that come up, if you don't have something until 11:59 p.m., you'll be waiting up to see if it comes in and if you still have a home deal. Okay. Alternative earnest money deadline. All that means is you're going to give earnest money typically to a title company, often predefined in the multiple listing service, but not always. You're going to give earnest money that just shows that you are truly interested and capable of buying this home. This third-party entity is going to hold that earnest money, and then you'll be credited that back at closing toward your closing costs. Record title deadline and tax certificate. That's the date by which the owner, the seller, has to get to you title work, which explains, any encumbrances on the property, any problems, and it's up to you, but you may want to have an attorney look at that. Your broker will be happy to look at it. They don't have the full authority to give you an opinion on that title commitment, whereas an attorney does. That's an extra expense, though, okay? Here you would have an objection deadline. In other words, if there's something in there you don't like, you would say something. And here, this is off-record title deadline. This is when the seller is supposed to tell you of anything that could affect the purpose and use and enjoyment of the property that has not been recorded at the courthouse or the county, okay? And you also have a chance to object to that. And then there's this title resolution deadline, which means what? This is the chance to fix this between you and the seller, and if you can't come to terms and you can't live with it, this is your time to go ahead and dissolve the contract, okay? Same thing, homeowner association. You're buying a home, but you're buying into the HOA if there is one. And you have to live within their rules and their demands and their fees. And so you want to get all those documents, you want to review all those documents, And you want to speak up if you're not happy with those. Now, the seller can't fix those for you typically, so that might be a drop dead for you. And that's something to consider every time you look at a home. Seller's disclosure, that's going to be a separate item. You can see how long this is taking already. And that's where they tell you what they think they know about the home. And on a piece of paper is what it comes down to. You're going to apply for a new loan in many cases, and there's certain deadlines to meet on all of those items. Almost always, there's going to be an appraisal involved. The appraiser is out there to, as a third party, state what they think the home is worth. And you might think, well, that's great protection for me. It's not. It's great protection for the lender. That's all they care about. Is this house worth the amount of money we're going to lend on this? And your contract will actually say, is this home appraising at the price I am offering? And if it doesn't, if it's over, great. If it's under, then you have a bunch of hard decisions to make. That's going to be a separate video. You see how fast this is adding up? We're going to talk about surveys and inspection location certificates. Essentially, that's the type thing where, is your property encroaching on somebody else's? Did the fence go on somebody else's property? Did the shed end up on somebody else's property? So on and so forth, and vice versa. Did somebody else's fence cut your backyard in half, or at least a corner of it off? And there's all those contingencies, all those deadlines, all those dates. You've got to watch this stuff like a hawk. You have to live and die with these dates while you're under contract with a property. And this just continues on down the road for the inspection. Due diligence. Due diligence is kind of separate from an inspection. Let's say the seller's advertising, brand new pool, just put in this spring. You want to know if that's by pool, I'm talking about a dug in, underground, pool. You want to make sure that all the permits were pulled and so on and so forth. You'll put that in your due diligence documents. Or if you have a finished basement and county records does not show a finished basement, you want to find out what's going on. You'll put that in the due diligence there. Okay. And finally, we talk about when it's going to close and possession date and time, and you're done. Actually, no. All you've done is outlined everything else that's in the rest of this contract. One last thing on the date and deadlines. If any deadline is blank in 3-1, this monster here, the whole thing, is 3-1. So if any of these things are blank or completed with NA as a non-applicable, or the word deleted is put in there. So if they're blank, NA, or deleted, you've essentially waived that as part of the purchase. So if you accidentally put in here that you want to do an inspection, actually it's up a little higher, inspection, objection, and you accidentally leave that blank, you're saying in the contract you're waiving that right. So you really want to watch that grid pattern a lot. Finally, we're going to get down here and talk about things like the purchase price, which you thought was the most important thing before you saw all that stuff. So what this does is this should add up. Here and here should be the same amount. So we're going to use a non-existent price in Metro Denver, Colorado of $100,000 purchase price. So that'll be here, and this will be down here by default. And all the stuff that happens in here should add up to $100,000. So you have your earnest money, and let's say you set aside $5,000, and you've got a new loan, and let's say that was for $80,000. Then what's left? You're not assuming this. We're going to do a new loan purchase on this one. You're not private financing. The seller's not going to cover it for you. So what would have to be in here? We've got $100,000, earnest money $5,000, new loan $80,000. To get this to $100,000, what do we have to have? We're going to have $15,000 in there. And so that gives you an idea of how that whole grid works. Now, we're going to really try to speed this up. Seller concessions, you can ask the seller to help you cover certain closing costs. That is something you want to talk about with your lender if you're getting a loan. There's going to be certain limits and criteria on what they will accept somebody else paying on your behalf. Work with your lender specifically on that. Okay. This mentions it could be applied to all these things. Check with your lender. Okay. There's things that come and go and change, and certain underwriting standards. Don't risk it. Check with them. There's a lot of stuff here that talks about your earnest money. And when it gets applied to closing, that means everybody was happy and everything got fulfilled. When you get into dissolving the contract within the covenants or agreement of the contract, sometimes parties get into dispute. That's going to be a separate video. You're starting to catch on how fast this adds up. So this talks about it, but we're going to go into more detail on a separate course, different video. And it talks about all these things. If you fail to do certain things, if the seller fails to do certain things, this would be a 10-hour class if we touched all this. Overall, you're going to be paying for your own loan costs, your own inspection, your own appraisal. It adds up quick. Get bids, get an estimate of costs up front so you don't run out of cash and you don't get caught by surprise. Now, obviously, if you've built into the contract that the seller's going to help you out, that's great. That helps. Sometimes they're willing to do that, sometimes not. And usually, if they are willing to help you, they may not be willing to negotiate price or repair. So be careful. It's all negotiable, and you'll have to balance out what's most important to you. Loan estimate and monthly cost, always get that from your lender. They're actually required to get that to you now. And it talks a little bit more about that, but that's the loan estimate. Don't worry about this stuff. This is not about assuming the seller's loan. This is not about having the seller finance it for you. If you're in that situation, you'll want to talk specifically to your broker and probably an attorney to make sure you're covered on that. We're just talking about new loan right now. New loan application, you're actually required to apply for that loan and get your lender and their underwriter all the stuff they'll demand, and it'll be a lot of stuff and you'll hate doing it, but you have to do it. New loan terms and new loan availability, you get a chance to review those things as long as it's what? Within the date, drop dead date deadlines, right? You get a chance to review all that stuff, and you can decide if you're going to buy the home based on those terms and based on those costs. And if you don't want to do that, then what you want to do is reject all of this and dissolve the contract within that drop dead deadline for you to do so. See how important those dates are? And as far as appraisals go, again, the appraiser goes out to protect who? Not you, your lender. And the conventional style loans, the FHA, Federal Housing Authority, and Veterans Administration loans all have slightly different criteria. Just know what sort of loan you're likely to be going with. Sometimes people start with a conventional and have to move over to an FHA to get easier terms, and that entails a whole different amend extend over to the seller. They have to approve that if you decide to do that. But for right now, these are the rules at which your home must appraise, and in most cases it would need to appraise at the price you're paying, or you need to decide how you want to proceed, if you want to proceed, or dissolve the contract. Okay. Cost of appraisal, pretty much always you as the buyer, you can ask the seller to pay for it, but the appraisal's covering your lender, and you hired the lender, so don't think the seller's going to do that without a little bit of coercion. We talked a little bit about HOAs, common interest community, homeowners association, whatever you want to call it. There's a lot of information here. We're just barely touching on it. But you want to get a copy of those documents and their financials and the fees they charge and what rules you have to live within. You know, if you like pink and green houses and they say you can't have one, you need to know that. And you want to make sure they've got money in the bank and they're not about to go bankrupt or hit everybody with a $10,000, extra fee to stay liquid in the neighborhood. You're going to want to get all that. And when do you want to get that? By the date. It states way up in paragraph 3 when you must have it. When you want to review it by the date up in paragraph 3. And if you have a problem or an objection when you want to do that, by the objection deadline in paragraph 3. See where we're going with this? The whole contract rides on that whole system. And this is all conditioned on your buyer review. And you can say, I am unhappy, I won't go forward, in your sole subjective discretion. That happens several times in this contract, but it's got to happen by that date. And it's pretty much always got to happen in writing if you want out of this deal, okay? This one here, title company, we're going to just barely touch on it. You can have the seller select the title company. And the way this often works is when the listing broker goes to work for the seller, they often agree on a title company. And there will be something in the MLS, Multiple Listing Service, that says, seller has chosen XYZ company title. Please make the earnest money to them. If you're not happy with that, you can override that by purchasing your own title insurance, but you would be paying for it. Or down at the bottom of this contract, you can say, you know what, I want to select it, but I want the buyer or the seller, I want the seller to pay for it. You'd have to put that in additional provisions and see if you could get it to float. What is title insurance? This is a third-party company that investigates the title, the chain of ownership, and any known encumbrances or problems with the property. And then they ensure to you that it's free and clear except those items they have listed. And usually those items they have listed are things that get taken care of at closing, like the loan the seller, the current owner, has on the property that gets paid off at closing. Typically, the title company is going to prepare all the closing documents and also work in collaboration if you have a lender to get all of that handled and integrated. So it's pretty important. And you can choose the title company, but just be aware it may entail you having to pay for it or negotiating with the seller to let you choose and they pay, keeping in mind that there's going to be a sub-clause to that insurance that you are still going to pay a premium for your lender to be covered. So essentially you would be paying twice if you take on the full expense on that. I didn't mean for that to go so long. Again, if you respond within the dates of the contract, you have the sole subjective discretion to say yay or nay on this thing. Off-record title stuff that the seller knows about that's not recorded with the county. Special taxing districts. This is important. It's going to be a separate video. And what happens is in the old days, the actual cities you were building in, or not you building, but the developer built in, would cover the cost of water, sewer, streets, whatever it was, and then tax you to recuperate that. A lot of cities found they couldn't afford that. And so they went to outside companies to fund that sort of development. And those outside companies have rights. And this special taxing district thing can be a little bit scary. That's going to be a separate video. Just because you see how long this is getting. And again, there's going to be a title resolution deadline, as with everything else. And we've kind of touched on this. New ILC or new survey. If anybody has a concern about your lot lines whether you've gone over them or somebody else has encroached over onto your property. They're going to order this up, and yes, they'll ask you to pay for those. Property disclosure, the seller is going to fill out a series of pages saying what they know about the property. It's good information, but you can't rely solely on that. Now, a seller can't hide anything that they call a material defect, which is kind of a big item, something important that would really affect the home. It's not that the back door porch light's burned out. They know there's a foundation problem. They know there's some electrical wiring that gets overly heated, that sort of thing, okay? Now, it's not their job to do an inspection, but if you can prove that they knew about it, such as, we've had electricians out 3 times in the last 2 years, and every time they said to replace the wiring, and every time we didn't want to spend the $25,000, then you've kind of got some proof. But that's kind of it's legal stuff. So I'm not giving you legal advice on that. I'm just giving you an example. So you talk about the inspection. You should almost always do it. Remember, we use this as our date line example. Do this on a certain date. Have this done by a certain date. Gives you the opportunity to resolve it by a certain date. And if not, then let's look at that right now. The inspection resolution deadline passes by executing an earnest money release. So if you're not happy about the inspection or various other parts of this contract, and you're dealing with it diligently, and you dealt with it by the dates you were supposed to, and you gave notice by the dates you were supposed to, you should be getting your earnest money back. Now, again, that's moving toward legal advice. We're going to talk about that in a separate video, separate course. Insurability, and I know I'm wearing you down, just a big overview today. Insurability is becoming big. Make sure you get a bid from ideally a couple of different insurance carriers to make sure that that home is insurable. We've had a lot of fires in Colorado, and sometimes it's in subdivisions nobody ever expected, like a big forest fire. Up in Boulder, they had a whole subdivision taken out by a fire. Things that didn't used to happen. And if you can get insurance, it might be a lot more than you expected. So it's important to look at that stuff, get some bids. This has to do on often rental properties, so don't worry about that right now. Due diligence we touched on. Those are special things that you want to deal with. We'll talk about water issues in a separate video. You're going to get a source of water addendum, and it's going to say where the water comes from in town. It's usually from a specific entity up in the mountains or plains. It could be a whole different story with wells and so on. We'll go into a different video on that stuff. Carbon monoxide, it's a law. The seller has to have carbon monoxide alarms. And within X number of feet, I've lost track, I think it's 5 feet of a bedroom door. Sometimes they're in my house, they're not only in the hallways, but they are in each bedroom. I believe I've got either 11 or 13 of them, and they're all wired together, and they're smoke alarm and carbon monoxide, and when they go off, all of them go off. And there's some recorded lady that starts yelling, and it is the loudest thing on the planet. And you definitely want to dive out the windows when she starts screaming. Transfer of title, we'll touch on this real quickly, but this is getting into legal stuff. This is for your general knowledge. But a special warranty deed is essentially the seller saying, we're guaranteeing that there's no stuff that's bad stuff that could affect your enjoyment of the property has happened since we owned it. General warranty deed says we're saying the same thing back all the way in time, okay, beyond when this seller owns it. And there's some other types of deeds and stuff. We won't go into those, but just kind of keep an eye on that stuff. We're not going to talk about some of the transfer taxes, but we are going to talk really quick. This is a separate video course. I'm sorry. Isn't this a little bit frightening? Are you kind of glad you're suffering through this right now? Because otherwise, if the first time you see this thing is the night at 10:30 when you're trying to get an offer in on a house and you're going, I'm terrified. I'm signing my life away with no knowledge of what's going on here. So that's why we're doing this. That's what the Homebuyers.University is all about, so you don't have that stress. FERPTA. The Internal Revenue Service, I am going to touch on this because this is a little bit scary. The Internal Revenue Service may require a substantial portion of the seller's proceeds be withheld after closing when seller is a foreign person. If required withholding does not occur, the buyer, you, could be held liable for the amount of the seller's tax, interest, and penalties. And you know how much the IRS likes tax and interest and penalties. What this is saying is you, believe it or not, are guaranteeing to the IRS that the person selling the home to you is not of a foreign country, that they are true, absolute U.S. citizens. And if they are not, and you don't bring it up, the IRS could hold you liable for up to 15% at the time of this recording of the sale price. See how fast that adds up? Yeah. Why do they do that? Because the IRS doesn't want to jump over to some other country and try to track somebody down when they know where you and the house is, and it's real easy to lien you. And so there's a whole different thing we're going to talk about, different course, and I'm going to be real careful not to give legal advice, but essentially we've got some solutions for you, or some proposed solutions. It's one thing you may want to talk to an attorney about. It's one of the most unfair things I could ever imagine the federal government doing to home buyers. Prorations, I'm just going to barely touch on this. So let's say that the HOA, Homeowners Association, is collected, let's make this easy, once every 6 months. And we are 3 months into that 6-month period. What that means is you'll have to reimburse the home seller for the last 3 months. They won't be living there. And then you'll have to give the HOA your full next 6 months, typically ahead of time. It's usually not that long. It's usually more like a month or two at a time. I just wanted to use that as an example. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that can happen including property taxes, HOA fees. It could be water. It could be a whole variety of things. Okay. We are not going to talk about too much here. This talks about if things happen when you go under contract, if something happens that substantially changes the house, floods, fires, problems, condemnation, if the city, state, county, or federal government decide to take over your home. Often it doesn't happen, but this kind of covers what will be how it'll be dealt with. Okay, so don't let it freak you out too much. As always, and at this point, paragraph 19, you no longer need this, but they're going to tell you again. They recommend legal and tax counsel. Do you see why? Anybody that's ever said, this is a standard state contract, just sign here, don't do that. Specific performance and liquidated damages, we're just going to barely touch on this, depending on which you check. What this does is it gives the seller certain rights if all of these contingencies are dealt with and everybody's happy and all the dates have been met and we're coming up on closing and you say, you know what, I changed my mind, see ya. Specific performance says they can keep your earnest money and sue you to complete the deal. Liquidated damages says all they can do is keep your earnest money and say bad things about you on Facebook or wherever else they want to talk to you about. And then this talks about things if stuff goes bad, how it's going to be handled. I'm not going to drag you through this right now. This one is always my favorite. And you know from previous courses when they mention written contracts or oral agreements, this is the entire agreement. If it's not in the body of this document, no matter what else somebody has promised or said or would happen or wouldn't happen, if it's not in here, it's not legally binding. Okay, just keep that in mind. Talks about how you can get documents. A lot of it's done over the internet now. Additional provisions. This box in most software will expand as big as you need it to. And you're going to put in here anything additional that you want to deal with. So let's say, for example, you did, way up at the beginning of this thing, you did want to pick the title company, but you do want the seller to pay for it. You would go ahead and try to work out those terms right here. Okay? Anything and everything that you have an interest in accomplishing that is not illegal can go in this box. And you'll want to be careful about what you put in there, but that's what this box is for. And it mentions here, this has not been approved by the Colorado Real Estate Commission. There's nothing wrong with this paragraph, but they don't know what you're putting in it. Okay? And that's it. After all that, you've figured all those things out, all those dates, all those things you have to do. You're going to go ahead and sign this puppy and put a little information about yourself in here. And if the sellers like it, they're going to sign this puppy and you're under contract and you're now under the gun and the time frame of all those deadlines and all these things that have to be done. If the seller does not like it, they have a couple choices. They can ignore it, and then what will happen is this will just expire at a certain point. Okay? Generally in here we're going to have a time frame where they have to respond. If they don't sign it, it expires. They could send a formal written rejection if they want, or they could counter it, and then you would receive a different document that says, you know what, everything's in here except, or everything in here is okay, except these items listed on our counteroffer. And then it's back in your court. Do you want to live with those things? Generally, they're going to give you a tight time frame, maybe 24 hours to respond. And it goes back and forth like that. So it gets kind of intense, and that's why you're trying to learn some of this general stuff before you get to that. And a little bit about your broker, and that's it. You live through it, and I'm so sorry. This stuff always takes longer than I had hoped. But it's so important, and it's just getting you familiarized with what's going on. And now we're going to do a whole bunch of smaller courses on some of these specific areas that might cause you specific stress, like earnest money and seller's property disclosure, and that FERPA thing from the government that says you're responsible to make sure that that person selling it to you is not from foreign countries. We'll go into details on that without killing you any further on this. Thanks for sticking with us.